Carolyn Dube here. What am I up to today? Well, today I'm making some intricate detailed backgrounds using more than one color. And if you've seen many of my videos, you may think, that doesn't really sound like Carolyn. Well, that was the old me. The new me, okay, it's not really the new me. I found a shortcut or a workaround so that I can get that complex detailed look without all the hard work. Well, how am I going to do this? With a stencil. I have created 3 stencils in a Layer Me collection where each pattern is designed to layer together or work together. That way it does the hard work and we don't have to. So you're going to see how I can combine this for both subtle, I know, strange to hear subtle for me, but yes, some subtle looks as well as some bold looks. So come take a look. Well, I'm all about making things the easy way. So what I'm doing with this stencil called Pebbles is I'm just rubbing on some distress ink, and just doing one layer of it looks fantastic and works all by itself that way. But if I want to add even more to it, what I'm going to do is, and I have registration marks here if that makes it easier for people, and that way I can line up the second pattern right on top of it. I'm going to come back in with the exact same ink, just go a little bit lighter, and all of a sudden it looks like this really complex pattern that people wonder how I did it. Well, let's try it now with acrylic paint in 2 different colors and see how this looks. I'm putting on the acrylic paint with a cosmetic sponge because that kind of keeps me from putting too much paint on there. If I only press down a little bit, I'm less likely to have paint run underneath the stencil, and that way I'll have the pattern exactly the way it is on the stencil. Gives me a crisper image the less paint that I use. Now, I did use some repositionable tape to hold this stencil in place to be sure it didn't wiggle on me, and that's going to make it handy when I lift this up and check and see if I like how it looks. If I didn't like it, I could have actually put the stencil right back down on it. Now the tricky part is waiting for it to dry, and I'm not going to wait the whole time, so, I might get a little bit of smear with it, but so be it. Now I am lining it up by the registration marks that I marked when I had the stencil on the first pattern, if that makes sense. Sometimes I use the registration marks and sometimes I don't. It's really very much about personal preference, but they're there if you want them. Well, now I'm going to bring in a contrasting color, and this time I want this really bright, happy yellow. I'm going to sponge that around with a cosmetic sponge, and the drier a sponge I use or the smaller amount of paint, the more likely it is that I'm going to keep a very crisp, sharp image. And when it's all finished, I've got something that looks very complex, but you know how easy this was to do. Well, this stencil is called Iron Grate, as in the grate on a floor, and it was totally inspired by Victorian ironwork and those ornate pieces around Victorian homes. I'm going to hit this with some distress ink, just rubbing it in there. I've put the repositionable tape just at the top of the stencil so that when I'm done, I can lift it up and take a look and see how it's going. And then I can put it back down if there are any areas that I feel like need a little more color into them. I can also then, if I want to, go ahead and fill in the registration marks. I've got a circle and a plus on each side. That way it'll make it easy to line up the pattern once you lift it up and move it. So I'm going to get that second pattern lined up on top of it using the registration marks, or a lot of times I don't even use the registration marks because I'll just eyeball it. It's very easy to see where this pattern lines up. So I've got the tape back on there so that I can then hit it with a more distress ink, but I'm going to come back in with the same exact color of distress ink. And you're probably noticing that I'm going over it a couple of times, making sure there's lots of ink with this second one, because what I want is there to be some contrast from the first layer of the ink to the second layer of the ink, because it's going to make the parts of the design pop out and create a complexity to it that looks, well, complex. But again, you and I know how easy it was to get that look by just using a stencil in layers. Well, let's go ahead and make this pattern fill the entire page. Is it the right side? Is it the left? Right side, wrong side, all that kind of stuff. It doesn't matter with this stencil. It's a completely geometric pattern. So all I have to do is just line it up. There's really not a right or wrong side to this. It's any side that lines up. Get my patterns lined up, and then I'm going to tape it down so that it stays in place, and then I'm going to fill in that pattern. So no matter what size piece of art I'm working on, I can fill it with this pattern. So when I'm finished, it will look like it was one stencil exactly the size of my page that I used, when you and I both know that the stencil part that I used was actually smaller than the page in my art journal, but nobody else needs to know that. That's just between you and me. And what you're seeing me do now is line up that last section. So I've got the pattern just the way I want it. Once I've got it exactly where I want it, and this is the eyeball method of doing it, I'm then just going to bring in that distress ink to fill in the last part of the page. This way I get an entire page filled in with that pattern. Well, now let's experiment around with some different colors for the second piece of the pattern by bringing in the stencil, lining it up, and I am just going to eyeball this one. I could use the registration marks if I wanted, but pretty much this one works as well for me eyeballing as anything else. This time I'm putting orange on the bottom so you can see the contrast of how it looks when you have two different colors with the two different parts of this layering stencil. And using similar colors gives you a very subtle look. Now I'm going to clean off that stencil because with distress inks, I don't want one color to mix with another color. So I'm just going to wipe off that stencil. And now I'm going to bring in a color that's not as subtle to work with that pink color. This time I'm going to work with blue. Now blue and red make purple. So I'm going to get this lined up. And when I put that blue distress ink on top of that, the parts where the blue and the red are both used, it's going to give it actually more of a purple look. Now these two are going to create a bolder look because there's going to be a lot more contrast between them, and people are really going to wonder how hard was that to do, but you know how easy it was to do. Well, I could just stop right here because that's a fun pattern, but all of a sudden I had this craving for glitter, so I grabbed my little bottle of glitter glue and I'm just putting a little hit of glitter right in the middle of each of these. Now I thought I was just going to do the middle section, but no, I think I'm going to do the whole thing. And now you can see the difference between taking a subtle approach or a bolder approach when using this stencil and the two patterns together. Totally your call for however you want to use it in what you're making. Well, now I'm going to build a background with a stencil called Connected Eyes. I'm bringing in some blue distress ink and I'm doing about 2/3 of the pattern with that. I'm going to flip this over, and I didn't use any of the registration marks. So when I flip it over, I'm just going to sort of eyeball it to make sure it lines up. If you find like me that it didn't quite line up, what that means then is you just need to flip the stencil because there is just a slight variation from one side to the next on this. Now I wanted to go all the way to the edge of the paper. Well, all I did was slide that stencil over, line up the pattern, and now I'm going to bring the distress ink right in on top of it. Where I had no blue, the yellow stays yellow, but where the blue is, then I got more of a green feeling. But where I've got that center green, I have little touches of blue around it, so it makes it look like a very complex pattern job when you and I both know how easy this was to put together. Well, now I'm going to make a very geometric looking pattern using just one portion of the pattern, but I'm going to use it twice. So I'm going to create the first layer of it by just doing a full-on pink stenciling of it. Now that we've got the base layer done, let's make some very geometric looking things. I've got the stencil right on top, then I'm going to give it a turn of 90 degrees. So now I'm going to line up the point to one point on one that's already been stenciled. I only have to make one point on the stencil touch one point that's already been stenciled. Hope that makes sense with the visual here. Once I've got it where I want it, now it's time to bring in another color. And what's going to happen with this is I get this very, very 3D geometric feeling pattern as these shapes overlap on each other. Well, now what I'm going to do is give it a little bit of a slide. So I've lined my stencil up again. I'm just going to slide it off to the side a little bit, and then I'm going to come in with the same color of distress ink, putting a light touch to it to create a whole different pattern. Well, you can see how all of these Layer Me stencils have so many possibilities using each layer by themselves or in combination. You can find all of them over at Stencil Girl Products. Hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, I'd love it if you gave it a thumbs up. Thanks for being a part of this colorful journey.